So welcome back to another episode of the StartWell podcast. I'm Qasim, and this time in studio with my friend Len Senator, who I haven't seen for I don't know how many years.
It's been a few.
Quite a few. In a previous life, we were working on projects maybe 15 years ago.
Yeah, getting close.
That were like web projects for all sorts of clients that you had at your studio called Hypnotic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And one of the anecdotes that I remember recounting to someone when I was telling them that you're coming in today was that as a designer, you made at that time, and it still sticks with me, some of the most interesting and shall we say, involved to implement designs for web interfaces. This is a time when, CSS was fairly new, and some of the interfaces you made, like I remember Camp Erewhon, right, the local kids camp, summer camp, and I remember you really kind of wanted to relate the camp experience through the interface, and there was this very cool design for the backdrop, for the background, and how it worked into it contextualized the content in that design. And I remember when we worked on that project, it stuck with me as something that more people should be thinking in that way. And I'm sure it's gonna that idea of contextualization of human experience is gonna work into our discussion today. Anyway, welcome to the studio, Len.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, in all fairness, I have to give credit to my business partner Barry Martin and our creative director at the time, Brian Howe. That Erewhon project, which was very, very beautiful, and I do think kind of ahead of its time, really was their baby. So that wasn't a project that I had my fingers in too deeply, so I wouldn't want to take too much credit for that one. But yeah, I did have a tendency to. I had studied, I had taught typography, and I had a sort of a real interest in design, and it was interesting as we got into web. Especially in the early days, it was in some ways a step forward with interactivity. I had also been doing a CD-ROM development and other kinds of interactive multimedia.
Sorry, take a step back there. Did you say CD-ROM development?
Oh yeah. So yeah, I'll take a step way back. We can come up to the CD-ROM part. So yeah, originally I studied commercial photography in Montreal. I was from Montreal originally, but I grew up here in Toronto, and then I lived in France briefly, and then I moved back to Montreal to keep my French from atrophying completely.
Yeah.
Studied
Upkeep.
Commercial photography there back when it was on film, and then towards the end of my studies, I got a demonstration of Photoshop 1, and I was, completely smitten, and I realized this is definitely where I wanted to go with that. And so I kind of dove in. I volunteered to work in a couple of places that had, at that time, sort of high-end Mac equipment like Quadras and stuff like that, and taught myself the early suite of tools. This is Photoshop before they had layers, even before they had multiple undos. So you had to get things right, and you had to understand how it all worked.
Right. It only worked on blue ink or black ink back then.
And so I kind of built up a toolkit before it was widely taught in schools, and then helped my alma mater, Dawson Institute of Photography, set up their first Mac lab. So I got a sense of that and ended up working in that area. And then having sort of transitioned out of photography just as that sort of digital revolution is starting to take root, I thought I'll future-proof my career and get really good at making CD-ROMs. So that's two entire technologies that I invested in mastering that became functionally obsolete in my lifetime. So
there's many more down the road, I'm quite certain.
Yeah. Well, so from those skills, and I moved back to Toronto. I worked in a service bureau. I became a teacher, teaching a lot of design technologies, taught typography for a long time, and built up a freelance career, and then eventually partnered with Barry to work with this company, Hypnotic, which he continues to run. Right. And we were partners for 8-9 years. Worked on a wide range of projects, and the company grew, the projects grew, the scale, complexity grew, and there was an effort to try to reconcile what we were doing with our values and our interests. I was a sort of a TED Talk techno-utopian for, quite a while. I drank the Kool-Aid, and I was, very much into this idea, the theoretical potential and possibility of this digital revolution to deliver, some significant transformations. And, things have not always necessarily gone as planned.
Right.
But there was a place where, when you work in design, you're...
But we're talking, let's just frame this for the listeners, like which years...
So this would be sort of from 2000 to 2010, let's say, for that 10-year period, what would be my 30s.
For all the kids out there, that's basically the time until Facebook took over the internet.
Yeah.
The re-commercialization of the internet post-boom of 1990.
Yeah. So, I was I was in photography in my 20s and design in my 30s, and then I on to the Deppanneur in my 40s, and 50s are still TBD.
I like how you're staging your life in decades and theme.
Yeah. And there's another overlay. When I was 25, I took a year off to travel around and sort of spent a year abroad.
When you were 25?
Yeah. So after I graduated, but before I came back to sort of dive into the career, I took a year to travel from pretty much around the world, from Bali to Delhi overland. It was an incredible experience at that time, sort of backpacking. And
what year was that?
That would be sort of mid-90s.
Man.
Yeah, so things have changed a lot. I still have a lot of slides left over from that period. To give you an idea of the difference between then and now, I actually designed and built a portable darkroom and had an antique folding camera that I could shoot black and white film, because my idea at the time was when I went to these places, I didn't want to simply take pictures.
Right.
If I was going to take pictures, I wanted to be able to develop and print in the field and then give the pictures to the people I was taking. I didn't want it to just be extractive. And so here I was, a long-haired hippie backpacker with a locked black suitcase with,
chemicals,
white powders, things wrapped in black plastic. Wires and timers and, metal canisters. And they would put it through the x-ray machine at the airport. And they're like, what's this? It's not like socks and underwear for sure.
Exactly.
And I'd be, it's photography equipment. And they'd be like, yeah, sure, go ahead.
Wow.
Not like...
Can't do that anymore.
No.
That's why we all take photos with our phones.
Yeah. So...
It's all customs.
Yeah, it changed a lot. So, there was always this idea of like trying to sort of connect one's practice with one's sort of set of values. And then as we got into the design world, design became this kind of close cousin to marketing, which is sales, which is, part of this whole kind of a growth economy, and you're kind of contributing, you're leaning in to kind of help people sell more things, make more money. And that isn't always without some challenges. And so we tried to figure out how to tie it in. So we tried to focus on clients that we felt were in areas that we were interested in or really cared about.
Right.
We tried to focus on clients who were trying to do something worthwhile in the world that had a meaning or purpose other than simply making the most possible money. We tried to encourage our clients to use their marketing dollars to do something genuinely worthwhile in the world, so that people had a reason to actually care about their brand. But then, after 10 years of doing that, there was a point where I had spent so much time trying to convince other people that they should be doing something worthwhile with their time and money. I kind of felt like, why don't I just cut out the middleman and just spend some time doing something I felt genuinely worthwhile with my own time and money. And so I switched gears. I think some of the luster had sort of worn off.
Right.
The design, as the kind of clients got bigger and the projects got bigger and the rates went up to match.
Yeah.
There was a sort of the bullshit to work ratio started to sort of shift. And I got to a point where I felt
too much bullshit.
Yeah. And you had to justify these rates to, and it's like, we're not talking to the gods. I mean, there's skill, but you had to kind of pad everything to justify.
Right.
And there was, all the buzzwords and I just kind of got tired of that side of it and started to feel inauthentic.
Oh, agency life.
Yeah. And it took a long time for me to find language around that. At the time, I wasn't enjoying it, and I couldn't really tell why.
Yeah, and it was tough in Canada. I remember the digital agency evolution in Canada was strange compared to other parts of the world, where clients, we're talking about clients that ranged from probably nonprofits to SMBs, and then the odd corporate gig that would be like the big money gig for no work. And between all of them, you wanted to give the same amount of detailed, thoughtful work and be charged fairly and equitably. But the budgets weren't there for everybody, or for other people. The budgets were so huge and they had no clue what they were buying, and it was the Wild West. And suddenly competition was on the scene too, right? So, yeah, it was a tough time. But I remember in Canada specifically, the lens for me was that like, whoa, how come no one wants to pay for anything? And when they do, they want to be done with it as soon as it's over. This was a tough thing for me when I was then running my studio after that Hypnotic experience, and developed a really good client list, and all of it was inbound, which was crazy. To think now, I didn't need Google Ads back then. People heard about my studio and they came to us for what we did, which was context-sensitive design for communication platforms, bespoke ones. And it was funny because I started like very early telling people under Design Guru, which was my banner, that this is going to be the price for this project. And then I had that conflict for the first couple of years of Design Guru, to drop the we from discussions and just say I, and then own that question mark that some people had, which was, I want to look under the hood and see how much work is being done, because that's what I pay for. I pay for work. And I was like, no, that's not what this is about. You pay for the solution.
And the value that it provides.
Exactly. Things may be different now, but actually I don't think they are. I think, I don't know, we see it with some clientele at the studios, like on the creative services side of like media production. It's still the same bullshit in the agency world. Depends on that nature of who you're working with, how they understand what you do.
Well, I do feel like there's this sort of split, like there's this corporate level where sort of money is no object. They're just sort of swimming in money. It's not coming out of anyone's pocket. It's just coming out of someone's budget. They can afford to pay rack rate for everything. And then you have, like you said, the small businesses, the individual entrepreneurs who are like trying to make it work, and the gap between them seems to be growing as part of the sort of larger gap in overall inequality, and contributing to that gap was something that didn't sit with me in that particular time place. And I felt like that was one of the pressing issues of our time and day. And if I wanted to figure out a way that I could sort of push in the opposite direction, could I do something to bring the poles closer together and create an accessible middle ground that people would feel at home in, rather than create a service that only the high end could afford? And that's the direction that I felt my design practice was going, and I was feeling alienated from that and the clients and the goals of the clients. And I decided I wanted to kind of refocus around the community where I lived, the people that I met on a human scale, experiences that were accessible and affordable. And, in hindsight, now that I'm working on telling this story more explicitly, was informed, for example, by the years that I lived in Montreal, where we had a lot of sort of bohemian artist types who could...
Oh, yeah, I remember.
And I mean, Montreal was a city you could afford to be broke in, which was one of the things that gave it its magic. And, we did a lot of creative, exciting, rewarding things, but none of them could be fancy because nobody had any money to spend on them. And compare that to Montreal, or to Toronto, where everyone's so busy, because it's very expensive. So you got to hustle hard to make rent, to make bank, and then there's not a lot of time and energy and creative energy left over to reinvest in the creators themselves. And so a response to all of that, and to my time in Toronto and my nostalgia for Montreal, kind of led me to the next major phase of my professional life, which was founding the Deppanneur. So
I'm interested in this. So like, how long did it take you to kind of envision the project, or was it pretty organic? Where was the Deppanneur born before we define even what the Deppanneur was or is? Well,
so there was probably about a year. So like I said, there was a kind of a growing unrest internally in me. I was chafing against the nature of the design work that I was doing. But I didn't really have a good vocabulary for how and why.
Right.
But the enthusiasm was fading.
Yep.
And that led inevitably, and I had a business partner who had a family, who had ambitions of his own that didn't necessarily align with mine. I wanted to do great work. I wanted to do interesting work. I wanted to do meaningful work. I wasn't that interested in doing the most expensive thing, in making more money and growing, and I didn't have those kinds of ambitions, and it didn't necessarily align, and that led to conflict, and eventually that conflict came to a head, and so there was a point where I had to make a decision to do other things, and so there was a gap where I had to figure out what was I going to do next.
Yep.
I still had a handful of my own clients and work I had to finish up. And it was a tough period. There was a bit of a crisis. There was depression. There was other things that kind of, but I was very fortunate in the support that I was given and other things to help me navigate. I just had a brand new house that I was trying to renovate.
Oh my God.
A lot of things happened all at once.
Wow.
And one interesting thing that came up is I picked up a freelance client. Was a woman who had worked as a therapist and facilitator for many years, and one of the areas she focused on was change management in individuals, specifically like people who were going to retire and didn't necessarily know what they wanted to do with themselves, especially when their identity and their value was very wrapped up in their work.
Yeah.
And so I kind of offered to basically typeset her work into ebook format for free in return for her access to her as a mentor, and to go through that process with her of examining what were the things that were important to me, and then using that to brainstorm around what kind of things would I like to be doing. And from that process and soul searching and a lot of sort of kicking some ideas around, I got a hot desk over at Center for Social Innovation Annex when it first opened.
Props to the CSI. Yeah. That's where co-working for me was cemented as something I could have a hand in as an industry, as a thing.
Yeah. And it was exciting for me, too, to see that people were bringing the sort of ethical dimension into the DNA of the business. And that spoke to me because that was also a place where I was trying to find focus. Yeah. And so I met a lot of really interesting people there. Tanya Sermon, who helped establish it. I watched and learned from them and the like-minded community. And from all of those conversations emerged this idea of wanting to do something with food, because I'd always gone through life stomach first.
Yeah. Tell me about that. Tell me about, like, even as your travels, were they guided by gastronomic, intent?
Well, they weren't.
Hunger?
They weren't necessarily intentionally led by food, but the food experiences ended up being among the most memorable and the most meaningful, and the ones that if I were to go back in my mind through the trips, people sometimes have that mental castle with the different rooms, to help them. I have like the menu of all the different things that I ate in the different places, and so I did kind of remember through my gut and experience through food, and it was a real convenient shortcut to memorable and meaningful experiences, and that kind of came to the foreground as I was thinking about it. Mm-hmm. I mean, the idea of frantically cooking the same thing every day for a bunch of people I never met didn't appeal to me.
Being a chef, the traditional chef in a restaurant.
I had read Bourdain's Kitchen Confidential, and that pretty much told me I just wasn't cut out for that kind of macho pirate ship kind of vibe.
First time I lived in Toronto was because after McGill, I'd gone back to Kenya, and was thinking of what to do. I kind of had this food experience as well because I loved cooking. I loved feeding people. But I had yet not experienced hating the dirty side of the hospitality industry. And so I'd applied to chef schools all over the world. And I got in, of course, all the fancy places you have to pay oodles of money to. And I was like, yay, I could wear all sorts of, logos on my lapel, on my fancy whites, and be a cordon bleu asshole, or I could go somewhere really cool. And I was like this close to going to the Spear Vineyard in Stellenbosch, just kind of like north, I guess, of Cape Town. And had all these dreams at the time of, as I got accepted there to their cooking school, which only had like 18 students or something, of creating these amazing, Impala medallion, dressed in like whatever local berry juice. I don't know. I got really I romanticized the idea. I went to South Africa. I checked it out. It was really cool. But something called me back to Canada. This was before we met. And I came back here and I was enrolled in George Brown's culinary school. Worked at a couple restaurants as a line cook. And within 4 months, I mean, my knife skills were amazing. I learned everything I could. But I got just abused in those kitchens. Totally out of the pages of that book. And like for me, I treated it like a scholastic, exercise. So I was just laughing at how ridiculous the people who called this their life was, and they didn't see it that way. So then when I called it quits one day, it was great. It was just a hungover morning where I basically called in and said, I'm not coming ever again, and was yelled at by the head of this particular terrible establishment that's gone bankrupt since, which I'm glad for and will not name on camera because it's shameful that I worked there, managing deep fryers and drunk people. But yeah, it's always sad when you really reflect on it and you say, okay, well, this is a field I want to be involved with because it's so part of my life. But at the same time, the conventional paths into that industry are they feel like there's a constrained narrative for you even there, like as a career path, and then it's not going to be fun. So what's the point?
So that's sort of what I ran into. I wanted to do something with food, but I didn't want to be a chef. And even the traditional restaurant model with its luxury and decadence and sort of social signaling just didn't really appeal to me. This was around a time also when pop-up dining was kind of starting out as a phenomenon worldwide. It was in Paris and London and New York and San Francisco. And there was this really interesting kind of intersection of arts and events and thing, and it was underground, and it really appealed to me. But I was like, why is none of this happening
here in Toronto?
We have the incredible diversity of talent, we have the ingredients, we have the interest, we have the and I looked into it, and what I kind of concluded was that the costs of setting up the infrastructure to do a one-off food event and the logistical barriers were so high that only people who were very well capitalized could consider doing it.
Right.
And then once they did that, it made the event incredibly expensive. And then only people with tons of money could go to that event. And then the whole thing became an elitist hipster clusterfuck that was just essentially not interesting to me. So I kind of came to the co-working kind of conclusion. If I created a place that had all of the infrastructure in place so that you could do this without having to reinvent the wheel, you could invite a much greater diversity of people to come and participate as cooks and keep the events much more affordable.
A co-worked kitchen.
Yeah. It's
co-worked restaurant.
Yeah. So it's essentially kind of what we built. And, we were able to make it so that we could lower the barrier to participation for the cooks, make it fun and interesting, exciting, give them a lot of creative freedom. And if it's fun and interesting, exciting for the cooks, it's going to be more fun and interesting, exciting for the guests. And we actually created a social dining experience. It wasn't a restaurant. People would share a family style meal, platters on the table. It's the only place in Toronto where I know where people pass food to each other. And that fundamentally changes the nature of those experiences. I thought about the kind of food experiences that I had that had meant the most to me, that were the most meaningful, the most memorable. They weren't the ones I spent the most money on.
No.
And so
you forget those. I find I forget those experiences.
They're commodities. They're transactions. You go, you spend, you think it's great, and then it's gone. But the ones that really stick, the ones that you shared with people, that you were in an exciting place where you learned something, where you felt connected to the food or to the cook or to the story behind what you were eating, that's what I wanted to create more of. And so that was sort of the design brief. Could I keep everything I loved about food and kind of dodge all the things I didn't like about restaurants? And I took over this, kind of abysmal corner store, sort of an inconvenience store.
Was this a rent? Did you rent that property?
I signed up. I took over their lease. Yeah. It's
a really interesting building.
It was a bank back in the turn of the century.
So it has that kind of it has that, I don't know, how would you describe the architecture of that building?
Yeah, it's sort of like 1850s sort of bank building, small town Ontario.
But it has that curve to it.
Yeah, it's on a corner. There was actually a mirror building on the other side of the street, so it was faced into this boulevard. It was one of the few older historical buildings in the neighborhood. I had moved into that neighborhood about a year and a half prior, so I was now living around the corner. And this idea of wanting to invest directly in the community where I lived. I didn't want to just live there and then hope something exciting,
you wanted to
interesting.
Build it, contribute, and enjoy your neighborhood.
I wanted to be part of the community.
The first StartWell was very much that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Ground floor retail, 1,000 square feet. I got the butcher next door to give me $5,000 as a seed investor. It wasn't the only money that went into that venture that got lost through a hole in my pocket and paid back to the butcher in the end. But I wanted someone in the neighborhood to de-risk that vibe.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the place had to feel a sense of belonging.
Yeah. This was all bootstrapped, so this was like I threw everything I had at it.
Yeah.
Took a big gamble, but it was mine to make. And I did everything. Was very resourceful. I mean, everything was repurposed, reused, recycled in an innovative way. I probably spent on that entire place what some places might spend on their espresso setup. So,
I know that all too well. I've literally brought to life, these great machines between these couple buildings of ours, just because I didn't want to spend. I don't know how people spend like $20,000, $30,000 on an espresso machine.
It's totally possible. So we did everything on the fly. Everything was, we actually even had when we first started, we had a community kitchen drive. We actually had a party and put up posters in the neighborhood and said, if you have extra plates and bowls and spoons, bring them by. We're starting a new community food space, and we ended up with enough stuff to fill a dozen kitchens.
Wow.
Why would you want to buy all of that stuff all over again from scratch? And then it got the community invested in what we were doing. We're like, oh yeah, we should go to that place. They have my forks, and
Grandma would be so proud.
Yeah, we became like the hospice for unloved mugs. Like people felt connected, and it made the place approachable and welcoming. And I had to learn a lot. I had not come from the food business. I had not worked in the food business. I knew very little about it. And after that first year, I had my ass handed to me. I mean, I had run out of all the money I had.
Yeah.
I had to sort of shut it down and turn it around and bootstrap it back up in a new format as well. I had this original idea that we would be this combination cafe corner store during the day,
right? And
then I would host these food events at night and a brunch on the weekends. And I thought I had partners originally, who were going to
you
look
said
after.
We.
Yeah, well, I mean, I tend to use the royal we a lot just because it's
for all your
inclusive.
Schizophrenic personalities.
But also, it takes a village. There's so many people who've contributed over the time. But in the end, what I thought were my culinary partners who were going to run the brunch and the cafe, one got the other one pregnant and they moved to Hamilton, and so I ended up having to do it myself. And then I thought, I'll do this pop-up food event in the nights. We'll have our events, and then we'll sell some coffee during the day. I mean, how hard can it be? Well, turned out
hard. The coffee business, really I tell you. It can eat you alive.
It was very challenging. And ironically, the stuff that I thought was going to be really hard turned out to be relatively easy, and the stuff that I thought was going to be easy, selling some coffee and stuff during the day, turned out to be so hard that I had to abandon it altogether.
While we're on the topic and on that note, for anyone considering, a change in career that would lead them down the path of starting an espresso bar or a coffee shop, any immediate anecdotes or particular recommendations for them?
If you're interested in going into the sort of third wave coffee espresso thing, then I'd say work at one and see what they're actually doing. Get a good handle on how it works. It's like, even going back to when I studied photography, I learned a lot of things, but I didn't learn what it meant to actually work as a commercial photographer.
Right. They don't teach you, or they didn't teach you that. They taught you how to take photos.
Yeah. And I'm not sure that a chef school is really going to teach you what it's like to run a restaurant, and so in the same way, I think you're going to, you might want to study, but the experience of seeing how a successful cafe actually operates behind the scenes would probably be incredibly valuable.
Great tip.
Leapt in, sight unseen, and and on the one hand, had I come from the food and beverage industry, I don't know that I would have done this, because it would have seemed like such a bad idea.
So it's not even about course correction. You wouldn't have been more agile. You just wouldn't have made that certain decisions.
Yeah, I think, I would have been sort of set in my ways. So the double-edged thing here is that it gave me a bit of a beginner's mind.
Yeah.
I approached what we were doing in such a strange way, so atypical, that I was able to create kind of a whole new category food venue. One of the challenges has always been for the Depanneur is, whether it's on Facebook or on the Yellow Pages or whatever, it's like it doesn't fit.
Sorry, what was that? The what pages?
Back when you had to choose a category under which you wanted your ad to appear, and I'm like, well, it's not a restaurant.
Oh, that's the worst.
But it's not a banquet hall, but it's not a cafe.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, you're a restaurant. What kind of food do you serve? I'm like, well, I serve 300 different kinds of things a year, but I never serve the same thing twice.
Sounds like Chinese food to me.
Yeah, but it's never the same thing twice. So it's like I couldn't even get a restaurant review because they would come to eat something and you'd never be able to order that food again.
Yeah.
So what I was doing was very, very outside of the box, both conceptually in terms of the standard restaurant model, and then as it turned out, it made it hard to fit into the very rigid box of city bylaws and business structures, which don't really flex very far to accommodate things that aren't designed to go in it. So there was a lot of navigating of that, and that took full advantage of the privileges that I have as a English-speaking, white, educated, articulate person to navigate this, this complex gauntlet of bureaucracy. And there are a lot of things that if they were that hard for me, I can only imagine how hard they would have been for a lot of the other people who would face similar things.
Oh, I'm sure. I've once in a while, I've actually looked at like bylaws to slap my wrists on certain innovations that we've wanted to do on campus and say, okay, this is going to take too many permits, or I don't even know how we get the permit. It doesn't say.
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
Some of the bylaws, you take a look at them and you wonder, when were these written?
Yeah.
The bylaw that ran my retail food store, for example, had a specific clause that forbid me to sell horse meat in quantities greater than a quarter carcass.
Well, I tell you, how do you measure that?
Yeah, and I guess at the time when that was written, clearly that was a problem. I guess bite size is not an issue, but
maybe that's that. Oh, that was before Doug Ford too, so that
was way before,
or Rob Ford or any of the.
So we had to find a lot of ways. So for example, between the licensing and the zoning, and there was a 6-year battle to get all the paperwork in order. And all I wanted to do was host a dinner party, and I wanted that party to be BYOB, so people could bring their own drinks and have it with their meal. And that is currently illegal in Ontario. If you take a fundamentalist reading of the liquor laws, everyone is forbidden to drink anything anywhere at any time except in a licensed establishment or a private residence. So I became a kind of a loophole hunter. And so the Deppanneur became the home of the Rush Home Park Supper Club, which was a private members association where people would buy a membership to attend a meeting where a free meal would be served. So no alcohol was bought or sold or served, but if members choose to bring their own beverage to their own meeting, I mean, who am I to tell them how to run their meetings? But their membership only lasted 1 day, so if they wanted to attend another meeting, they had to renew their membership.
But of course, that's a story. Right? That's a story for a would-be inspection by a figment of our imagination inspector.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a license that you need to have on the wall.
No, but I mean, you had to...
Because I went through the same process of like, I need to build this story to be credible and relevant to that potential inspector. Yeah. These inspectors don't exist.
Well, there's a few things. First of all, there's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. So you have to kind of figure out the structure of the rules, and then you find the cracks in them where you can flex to create things that don't currently exist. And then, going into this, I didn't know how vigorously or rigorously these laws would be enforced. And I ran afoul. I had a summons to go to court for operating a victualling house.
A what?
That's what they would call a restaurant in the bylaws, right? To give you again an idea of when they were written.
Yeah, back in the stronghold of the Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah, so so it took a lot of time to figure that out. And there's also practical politics. I mean, from my understanding in Ontario, all the liquor stuff is administered at the provincial level by the AGCO, but they want the enforcement to be done by the municipality bylaw officers. And so they have this kind of pissing contest where they're like, you enforce it. No, you enforce it. No, you pay me. No, you're going to pay for it. And I'm like, no, I won't do it. Well, then I won't do it. And so nobody enforces it. So the other thing is a practicality of scale. This was a tiny little corner store. We say 24 people. if people have a glass of wine with dinner, the fabric of civilization is not going to unravel, So unless somebody, very maliciously narked us out, right? Yeah. It was unlikely to stir the pot.
Sure.
So I was taking advantage of what was possible at the scale that I intended to operate. Understanding that if you go into something that everything we do has to be scalable and franchisable, and then you're going to kill a lot of ideas before they're even had a chance to,
absolutely.
to thrive.
It's difficult because that's kind of a societal. It's incumbent upon you to participate in society in such a way that it feeds this bigger, better, faster, more, right?
Yeah, and so the Depp was sort of me shaking my tiny fist at that, and I really wanted to create something of finite human scale. It was a one-man show. It was a thing that was created human scale experiences that were unique and exclusive, not because they were super expensive, but because they only happened once. They happened that one time, and you shared it with those people, and that's what made it precious.
Snapchat before Snapchat.
Yeah, something like that. But, so a lot of these things emerge. And so from that emerged this place, which became a showcase for culinary talent in the city. There was a time where I was running somewhere in the order of 300 unique culinary events a year.
How did you source the people that were offering the food, like cooking in the kitchen? It
was a mix. I mean, for example, the Depp started around contemporaneously with a thing that was the Toronto Underground Market, which itself was modeled on a San Francisco underground market now, which had caught my attention at that time. So that market was intended to be sort of a culinary night market where talented home cooks could show off their wares. And I thought that was super cool. And that was a big inspiration for what I wanted to do. I even went down to San Francisco to try to do some research. And then Toronto created a version called TUM, the Toronto Underground Market, but it quickly got absorbed by that exact kind of ambition that you're talking about, and it went from being this nascent idea to this, 2,000 person gigantic brickworks thing with a $50 ticket and an hour-long lineup and corporate, and they burnt themselves out essentially, but by the time you were being expected to show up there with 1,000 covers of food, you weren't really showcasing underground talent anymore. Right. You were really
You're a caterer.
So it stopped being underground pretty quickly. And, the scale at which I designed what I was doing was designed to genuinely underground. But to answer your question, so for example, I would go to the Toronto Underground Market. There would be people sort of dipping their toe. Now, it was a great platform and springboard for a lot of talent as well. I mean, they did fill a niche. It was just a bigger one than mine. And I would go there and say, I love what you're doing. It's really cool. There's a place that you could come and do this. It would be just you instead of you competing with, 50 other vendors. And so I would solicit from them. There's one food truck was just trying to get some momentum in the city. I would contact those people. There were some Facebook groups that were starting out there, a Food and Wine Navigator. I would reach out to people there.
Yeah.
I would go, to markets, farmers markets and food affairs and, Taste of the Danforth, whatever. And anywhere I saw interesting food, I'd drop my card, a little solicitation letter. But it was really based on those personal connections. And then it was designed to be inherently viral. So in the old school word of mouth way, people came to the dinner. They knew that the person cooking was often not a professional cook.
Sure.
And so then they would go away with this idea, there's this place where I know somebody who loves to cook. They would love to do this. And so they would tell them. And then the cooks would know each other, and they'd be working at a restaurant, and someone would come on board and they're like, you're really talented. Why don't you go do a pop-up there as a side hustle, make a little extra cash?
Nice. So it's a cipher. It's like a hip-hop cipher.
Yeah. And so over time, it picked up enough momentum. And, it's always been a mix of one-offs and unique things. And, you have total first-time amateurs who've never cooked for the public, and you have fledgling professionals and culinary students and people who've just come from out of town. And then you have, seasoned pros who don't always get the creative freedom that they want. You're working at a fancy French restaurant, but you really want to be making, Sichuan, you're out of luck. So we give them a place where they can come and play.
Yeah.
So different people come for different reasons. And the accumulation of all of this has, been this incredible richness of food and culture in this little tiny space.
So it's been how many years now?
It's been just over 10 years that I've been running this space. So, and we've done thousands of different things. We also do cooking classes and workshops. We did a lot of private events. People got married in that space. We ran brunch residencies that would last a year and then change over. We did a lot of different things.
It's interesting because there are restaurants that definitely don't last anywhere near that long, that either are bootstrapped or ridiculously overfinanced, and that probably deal with as much, chef turnover, staff turnover. Well, okay, not really. But like, the thing is that compared to a restaurant, I guess, there's a couple questions I have. One is the business model question. How does this thing sustain itself, or how has it? I hope for yourself that you got out of the early financial quagmires of putting everything into this thing.
Well, I'm still there, so it still exists. But it did take a while. So there are a few sides to this. One thing I'll just say about the restaurant model as it currently stands is that it's so expensive to do in the city, so capital intensive, that tends to constrain creativity in a huge way. Because when the
you have to have a model,
when the stakes are so high there's so much money,
and when the stakes are so expensive,
then you
bad.
People basically are looking for the next really trendy thing. They want to jump on it, milk it for all it's worth, and cash out.
Yeah.
And so you end up with a lot of copycat, derivative, trend chasing. I mean, if I see one more barn board Edison bulb fish taco, I lose my freaking mind, right? But it's a byproduct of expensive real estate and high capital costs and so on and so forth, that people can't take creative risks.
Right.
And so the Depp is sort of the opposite of that. It keeps the stakes super low, so that people can try and do interesting creative things that might never fly, but might still be worth doing. I mean, we did a night that was a half Haitian, half Scottish fusion dinner called Voodoo Haggis. Now, I don't know you're going to build a restaurant on that, but for one night, you can do something and that's genuinely creative, and that is exciting for me.
Scary.
It was actually terrific. Awesome. Yeah. And, very talented cook and, really interesting story behind it too. So, as far as the business model, it's always been a shared risk, shared reward model. So we invite, for example, we'll invite a guest cook to come in, they prepare the meal, and we split the money. And it's as simple as that. They get to use the facility. I provide the sort of sales, marketing, ticketing, infrastructure, front of house support. They pay for their ingredients, and we divide it up. It's either 50-50 or 60-40, depending on the nature of the event, and the ticket price. So if it sells out and everybody's happy, we both take home more than we would have made working in a restaurant, for the same night.
Right.
If it does really poorly, we both take a hit, and we share the risk and we share the reward. My ambition, as I mentioned before, was pretty modest. So I went into this with signing a 5-year lease, saying if I can get to the end of this lease and not be any poorer than when I started, I will consider that a success.
That's a great metric.
And I actually hit that target. It wasn't easy, but the first year I was way deeper than I started.
Sure. Yeah.
And then picked it up, and then by 5 years I had paid off everything I had paid off and was back to sort of square one, and then I could actually start building from there, and it's done well, and well enough, and I don't need much. I mean, another function is it's a function of a certain kind of privilege that I have. I mean, I spent 10-15 years working in design. I don't have a lot of other cripplingly expensive hobbies. I don't have a family. I don't gamble. I'm not doing other kinds of stuff. So I took what I had. I put it in my house. I live in 1/3. I rent 2/3. My living at my room and board is pretty cheap. I have the Depp. It was and when
You've nailed the millennial zeitgeist.
Well, it was made possible because the place that I took over, this horrible corner store, was really cheap. It had a crazy old landlord, and the place was a shithole, but the rent was really low. And because it was low,
you could experiment. You're not really
invest in
much.
Fixing it up.
Yeah.
I could make mistakes, and those mistakes wouldn't be catastrophic, and I could pick myself up and figure it out. And over the last 10 years, the rent went from being a great deal to being a good deal, to the landlord passing away, the kids taking it over, and now it's really not much of a deal at all. It's gone up more than 300 50% since I started.
Terrible.
But the room hasn't gotten any bigger.
No.
And the model hasn't significantly changed. I mean, I've had to adjust pricing and I've added more things, but I'm essentially maxing out. And so one of the big lessons of the Depp is what is possible when you keep the stakes low, when things are affordable, like Montreal was affordable, like Toronto. As I watch the city become so expensive, I really get concerned about the cost of gentrification, the cost to our culture and to our society and to the quality of our lives when inexpensive things have nowhere to live. You can't have a vibrant and dynamic food ecosystem in the city at the grassroots if there aren't affordable places to make the food and serve the food and eat the food. And so, I'm sort of in a transition right now, and, remains to be seen whether the climate will allow for something like the Depp in this new rental landscape.
No, it is difficult, especially, when we talk about the rapidly escalating commercial real estate pre-pandemic, inflationary pressure, it's doesn't even, there's no sense to it.
Yeah, it's disconnected from the earning capacity.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course there's property tax issues and the idea of that, suddenly if a property is worth so much more because everyone's paying more to live in that neighborhood, the high street should be worth more, and then people charging more rent because they're like, everyone's rich in this neighborhood, so and it's just an abstraction.
There's a lot of things that need to be fixed. I actually became really interested in the sort of larger systemic issues, and I reached out to an organization called the Urban Land Institute that sort of does a lot of sort of consultation on development in cities around the world. I knew the director of the Toronto chapter, and we actually started a roundtable on social purpose real estate. This idea that real estate has other functions other than as a financial vehicle, other than simply residence. That if there are no affordable places left, what is lost. Right. And we began to sort of champion this conversation in a space where I don't think that conversation was being had. And so, I feel like I'm trying to use the Deppanneur as a example. And I'll give you one example. So, about 7-8 years into the project, around 2016, this is when all the Syrian refugee families arrived in Toronto. And, everybody kind of they were stuck in hotels. They didn't have any way to make food for themselves or for their families. And people wanted to help. And I was like, well, I want to help. How do I help? Well, what do I have? I have a kitchen. So what can I do? I can put my kitchen at the disposal of the people who don't have one. Yeah. So we started a project called Newcomer Kitchen, and we invited the Syrian refugees to come and use our space to share some, to make some familiar food, share a meal, bring some leftovers home for their friends. And from that, it kind of grew into this incredible project, which expanded to work with over 80 Syrian families. We turned it into a weekly pop-up. We were selling 50 meals a week, and we were using a similar model. We were generating revenue. We were paying the ladies, paying for all the ingredients, paying for the packaging and all the overhead costs, and then all the profits were being given to these women.
That's amazing.
And we ran that for 3 years, and it became, a really high-profile project. It was in, the New York Times and the Guardian, and and Time magazine, and it became a really Canadian response to the Syrian refugee crisis.
Right.
And I think it demonstrated again, the possibility of what can be done if profit isn't the defining a metric that everything has to be measured by.
Right.
So we created this sort of nonprofit spinoff that built on the Depp's DNA of entrepreneurial support and food and community building, and created this. And it's now its own standalone nonprofit organization that's continuing to work with newcomer women in the city. So, these are the kind of things that can take root, not because they were funded from the top down, not because they were this act of benign philanthropy by some billionaire, right? But simply because, like the Depanneur itself, because you created a space and held a space, and nature abhors a vacuum, and all this creativity and talent flows in to fill that space if you can keep the barriers down.
It's definitely something that's intertwined with the ethos here at StartWell, right? We started as a co-working space, definitely aligned with technology companies, right? That was my impetus for founding this company, was to create a private sector space because I would be free of bureaucratic restrictions if I was government funded in any way to support the evolution of new technology in this country and the development of early stage ventures, tech ventures, startups. And then it's grown because in many ways we've found community, and community is in this city so diverse. So even technology is, of course, part of everything in society these days. So we've had to expand our scope of who we enable on campus and what we do to enable them with so many more services and spaces that are creative, like this one, right? Where we're recording this kind of podcast. But around the corner, we have this, fully built out film and photo production space. And it's funny because it's like a really terrible business. It's terrible. It's funny because I was just telling someone from the world's largest, co-working flex space vendor, IWG Group. We were talking earlier today. And I was saying that because he was asking me, how do you make money in this film stuff? Like, is it great? Is it terrible? I don't know. We just don't know. We are not in that business. And I'm like, but you're the biggest, office space people around. And they're like, but it's not our business. So it's very interesting that, we've had to go into that a great unknown because we saw a need for our members to have creative space, right? And the more I scratched the surface, the more I realized that if you wanted to do a film shoot or a photo shoot and you needed a 2,000 square foot psych with, cornerless walls, where do you go? You have to go up by the airport. You have to go east into Film City where you can't get a booking because all the big lots are booking at the small lots to do things like photo shoots for poster art and stuff like that when they have talent in town. Or you go west, and if you're in a photo studio, it might not be sound treated. So how do independent filmmakers, documentarians, whoever else do interview shots? So I was like, wow, this is definitely ticking all these boxes. But the comps for people coming into book space are still those spaces. And they say, you know what, it doesn't cost me anything to take my Honda, fill it with equipment, and drive out to the airport. It does, but they don't factor in that cost. And so I'd rather go there if I'm saving $800 on the booking fee. So it was really interesting is to say we're actually sacrificing income, but providing creative space because we're offering it on a competitive pricing model. And it's like top tier, just like anything at StartWell. It's got gear and grip, lighting, everything's there with the bookings. But we're doing that to enable the people to be able to produce stellar stuff. And we've had we've had indie filmmaker Ryerson University graduates come in there, use the space with the same equipment that the team who just shot, I forget his name, but Simu is his first name. He's like the new Marvel superhero. And he's blowing up in terms of being an icon for Asian community globally, East Asians and Asians in general. And such a nice guy. But he was in our studio for Nobis because Nobis is another great Canadian company. He's their brand ambassador for the next year. The same space where something like that has big scope, is being shot is now accessible because of our pricing model to a recent film studio graduate. But it takes us eating, the potential gains of only going after commercial clients to subsidize in a way the rate that we're offering people.
Well, the co-working model appealed to me because it was, emergent from this sort of sharing economy ideas, this sort of optimism, the democratization of access. So at the Deppanneur, for example, I have the kitchen and the event space on the main floor. And in the basement, I took over a second unit. There's a whole story of how and why, and made it into a secondary prep kitchen, which has always been rented out to a rotating cast of different fledgling entrepreneurs, food entrepreneurs. So there's half a dozen sort of local food brands that have incubated in that space and gone on. And they often carry that DNA with them when they go and finally outgrow the shared space into their own space. They get a space and then share it themselves with other people. And so, this idea that if you have the space, you can enable things because the sharing of the space is the tool by which you lower the barrier to entry. A lot of the people who have started out in the Depanneur kitchen weren't ready or couldn't afford to put down the lease and equip an entire space for their business yet. Right. So it gave them a stepping stone, a launch pad, an on-ramp into entrepreneurialism that wasn't readily available. And, I was doing it very, very much at the entry level. And then above me, there were some other food incubators for people who wanted to sort of scale up or go national, or, so there are different tiers at every step along the way. And so, you find your niche in that escalator. But I also have this idea of like surplus capacity. With the newcomer kitchen model, one of the ideas was, how much kitchen space is there in the city that sits idle and empty for how much part of the day?
Yeah.
It couldn't be used to help newcomer communities, to help at-risk communities of all kinds. So I wanted to show that, hey, that one day a week when I'm not using my kitchen, look what we can do. Right. And so, in that way, I wanted to kind of show by example the transformative power of simply idle capacity.
Oh, yeah.
And so you have this studio, and other space. And so the question becomes, you want to fill it as much as you can possibly fill it, but nobody's filling it 24/7. So the question is, what can you do with it when it's not being used? And it works into real estate as well. This is what they call meanwhile spaces. So, the developer takes over.
Well, even this building, like all of our property is redevelopment property. Yeah. Our landlord will knock it down and build condos or some sort of like mixed retail living space in the next 5-10 years. You know?
So what are we doing in the meanwhile? And so there's a lot of opportunity there. And I do feel like those are the cracks that we talked about where the light gets in, that they create opportunities to do things where the regular market has made those things inaccessible.
I think tell us a little bit about the new project, because I think it's an evolution of this, the book. The book has 300 recipes?
So no, it's 100 different recipes by 100 different chefs who have cooked at the Deppanneur over the last 10 years. So as we ran into COVID, I had to sort of shut down the majority of all of the sort of in-person activity that we did. So we kind of had to reinvent a new model as a pickup only food venue. So we still invited guest cooks. They would come in, they would develop a menu, but it was for pickup only. We were doing that twice a week. We had to shut down the brunches and the private events. And so we kind of went back to a skeleton kind of operation. But, what we learned was that this pickup model actually had other strengths and weaknesses, and that we could do a higher volume that we could used to be able to fit in the space. So we were able to offset that. But while we were sort of navigating this COVID space, I tried again to think of what can I do with what I've got. I have this surplus time capacity now, and we were hitting this 10-year mark, and I decided, why don't we do something that supports the community of cooks that we have and tells the story of what we've done. So I decided I wanted to make a cookbook that told the story of the Deppanneur, that showcased this incredible diversity of talent, because I've never really seen a book that actually looks like the people who cook in this city.
Yeah.
So we have 80 different nationalities in this one book. And then I did some due diligence and did some research. And I quickly discovered that the only business model worse than the food business model is the food cookbook business model. So it became clear. So essential to the Depanneur's ethos is people get paid for what they do. We might not be able to pay a lot, but we dignify and we respect. We don't get people to do things for free, for exposure. So if I was going to invite 100 people, I'm going to pay them all an honorarium for being in it. And I realized that was simply not going to be possible with the kind of money that was available for a Canadian cookbook for a brand that may not be well known. It's not a celebrity chef. So we took it to Kickstarter, and that's really a big lesson there. With 10 years of building a community who genuinely cares about what we're doing, what we're trying to do, who we support, they really rallied around this project.
That's
and
amazing.
So this Kickstarter for the cookbook ended up becoming the most funded Canadian cookbook project ever.
Wow. And
we were able to sell over 700 advanced copies of the book that didn't yet exist and raise enough money to take the photographer, to hire an amazing photographer, Sanya Hotik. She herself was one of the cooks who had cooked at the Deppanneur and has now become a published cookbook, food photographer. This is, I think, her third cookbook. And we've been creating this book. And so we've shot in like 97 out of the 100 recipes already, and we're interviewing all of the chefs and talking to them about their relationships to food. And again, not necessarily being professional chefs. These are a huge range and diverse kinds of people who are sharing their recipes. And there's so much incredible storytelling in there that's not going to fit into the book, that we're actually thinking of trying to build out a podcast that really unpacks the stories of the food, and in anticipation of the book, which has just recently been picked up by Simon & Schuster.
Congratulations to the whole community. That's fantastic.
But when you get in with a big company like that, you kind of get in line with all the other projects they have in development. So and there's a big sales cycle and stuff. So it's not going to be in the world till 2023. So in the meantime, what do we do to kind of build anticipation for what's going to be in there? So we're looking at telling those stories, amplifying those voices in some interesting way. And I'm actually looking at taking a little bit of a break after 10 years of this. I'm actually kind of gearing up for a sabbatical. I was talking about themes and overlapping cycles and periods. So when I was 25, I took a year off and traveled around the world, and now I just turned 50. So
congratulations, you made it.
Maybe
50.
I'll do that again. So it's like a quarterly report. I'll check in every 25 years. I'll do it again when I'm 75. Probably won't do it when I'm 100. So, may as well carpe diem.
Man. So what, do you have plans for that year abroad, or you're off, I should say?
All things considered, it's really hard to make those kind of plans. We're not out of the woods yet.
No, definitely not.
So if COVID's been one thing, it's been an exercise in living in the moment.
Right.
But I definitely hope to do some traveling. I definitely hope to do some eating, and rest, and but also sort of gather wool and sort of sort through the experiences of the last 10 years and use them to sort of define where I want to take the Deppanneur next.
Well, it was an absolute pleasure. I'm looking forward to that podcast, and I'm sure we'll talk offline about helping that be produced.
That would be very cool.
And it's been a pleasure to hear about the whole story. And of course, StartWell, in whatever way we can help, is here.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure, Len. Thanks.